Co-creating great relationships basically means that we have to be active in great relationships. So great relationships don't just happen by accident, and somebody isn't just naturally good at them usually we've got to pair people right, we've got to work together well, and we've got to understand each other differently and ourselves. So I'm not standing here saying I've got the best relationships in the world. What I'm saying is that I think it's really important to consider how we co-create great relationships with people about it, you know. So relationships they take effort and work to create really great ones. I don't think we're always told that or understand that, and we don't always see that role modeled. So sometimes we can get lost in how do we co-create them. So that's what we're going to talk about the kind of rules or the pieces involved. But we don't often have a really strong relationship with how it feels when we're in a great relationship. What are those actual feelings that we have that tell us we're in a great relationship? Because that's one of our signals. So what are we really talking about? So I'm going to give you my Venn diagrams. I'm a little bit obsessed. So ultimately, I'm talking about the space you share with another person that isn't avoidant or enmeshed. Okay? So the space in the middle is what we're talking about. This can take a little bit of effort. Okay? What can happen is, this is one form of relationship. It's where you can actually have two people who coexist, but there's a distance between them. There isn't an overlapping of some kind of connection occurring. So they can coexist, they can live in the same house, you can work in the same office, and you may not actually be relating, you may just be coexisting. Then there's the enmeshment model, and that's the model that is closer to the kind of terms like codependency and what that book is written about. And that's where our sense of self and our sense of the other is so overlapped that we don't really clearly know what we're focused on when we focus on the relationship. We may end up being focused on the other person rather than the relationship. What is in the relating? So everything to do with work, family, shared goals and projects, peers, love and romance. It's somewhere where we meet with an intention with another person of some sort. So if it's a romantic one, we usually cross over and intend to have a romantic relationship. If it's family, it's to have a family relationship. We may have a relationship with somebody at work because we share goals or share projects. We may have relationships with peers because we go to the same programs or the same development work. But basically, a relationship is where part of us meets part of another person. But if we look back at those two other examples that I just gave, this is where we become consumed by another person. And this is where we don't really connect to the other person. We just coexist. And so a lot of relationships fluctuate between all of those. But this shared space is what we're really trying to think about now, is how do I co-create great relationships in this shared space? So this is also where inclusion happens. So inclusion doesn't happen because I'm really intentional in my mind about how inclusive I should be and others should be. Inclusion happens at the point where I meet other people and I make an effort to include them. And exclusion is the default. So one of the things that can get lost in talks about inclusion is that actually we are naturally programmed to be exclusive. We're naturally programmed to look for people the same as us, who think the same, who agree with our opinions, who mirror us back to us. Whereas just like relationships, inclusion requires us to go beyond the intention of being inclusive and sometimes working against defaults. And we'll talk about the defaults that happen in relationships in a moment, but they do have a commonality. So exactly where relating happens is exactly where inclusion happens between you and others. So that's the link, is that a great relationship is also good for inclusion. So one of the things you can do is, by understanding how to take into account other people and contribute to the relationship you share, you'll also develop skills in your ability to be inclusive to other points of view, to other people, and in situations that you may generally miss or have blind spots. So what's good for a relationship is good for inclusion. Okay, so let's talk about the reason that inclusion matters in great relationships is exactly what you've just shown, that when we feel included, the feelings that come with that promote more engagement. They also lower our defenses. But when we feel excluded, because it's a default primal response to need to belong, we tend to feel rejected, hurt, angry, lonely. We have all of those responses which trigger our nervous system to kick into defense. Okay, so the link between inclusion and great relationships is that when we don't feel included, it makes it really hard to build a great relationship. When we feel included, it is much easier to relate to somebody without all of the mess that our defenses creates in relationships. I'll talk about 3 techniques. And I was thinking about the first name. I was like, will I make it sound nicer? But no, fight better. So there's a technique called fighting better, and you need to learn how to fight better in order to co-create great relationships. Then there's a piece around understanding how our cognitive bias influences our interactions with others. And then there's a piece around our psychological perspectives. So let's start with fighting better. Okay, so there's 3 steps to fighting better. I'm going to give you an example of a fight because I think it works really well. And this actually isn't something I fight over, but it's something that I've heard when I work with individuals trying to improve their relationships repeatedly. Okay, so you didn't put the bins out. Okay, so one partner says to the other partner, you didn't put the bins out, you don't care about me, you never put the bins out. I always have to remind you, you're just so distracted with X, Y, and Z. Now, if that doesn't relate to you, if you can't find a kind of slight relationship to that on another topic, I want you to think of another pet peeve that someone might have that's in your life that they constantly bring up that drives you nuts, because it will help you work through fighting better with me. I'm going to use the bin example, okay? So a frustrated partner who feels unheard, not listened to, the bins aren't being put out, they constantly have to nag, the other partner is distracted, annoyed that they're being nagged, and the fight continues. Okay, so step 1 is know what happens to you in conflict. Okay, so most of the time when we get into conflict, we want to look at the other person and what they're doing wrong, what they shouldn't have done, what they should have done, what you wish they did. But what we don't do as easily is know what's happening for us. So when we're in a fight, we don't as easily come into ourselves and say, okay, how am I reacting to this conflict? What is happening within me that is adding to the fight? So the things that happen to us are fight. So we have a defensiveness. Well, I can't remember to put out the bins all the time. We have flight, which is, oh, I'll do it next time, and getting out of the room. And we have freeze. I can't think. I just can't answer you. I don't know what to say. So you need to, this is a very basic one. It's based on polyvagal theory, but on a very basic front, when you think about getting into a fight with somebody, which one of these do you think you do? Do you think you become defensive and fight with them? Do you think you try to avoid the argument and get out of it? Or do you think you freeze and kind of lose sense of how to respond? So lots of I don't knows, I can't think, I've gone blank, that type of thinking. The first thing to know is what's happening to you. So you're really good already at figuring that out, okay? And I want to say this, as a person who teaches this and coaches people on this, I still have to count to 10 and say, before you go and give out to them about everything they've done, what's happening in you, because I'm still caught in it. This knowing better doesn't actually result in doing better when it happens in our nervous system. But what can happen as we move through this is a step you can do to help your nervous system. The next step is to understand their complaints as requests for unmet needs. Now, this one was life-changing for me when I figured this one out. When someone complains to you, they're actually telling you indirectly that they have an unmet need, that they may not know they have, they may not know how to ask you, or they may be really uncomfortable with asking you to meet that need. And I'm going to use the bins as an example, okay? So in the case where this person was giving out to their partner for not putting out the bins, when we actually delved into it, what this person actually wanted wasn't the bins to be put out, but they didn't know how to say to their partner, I don't feel cared for in this relationship. I don't feel that my needs matter to you, and I don't know how to have that conversation. And so when people come to us and complain about something, our defenses are going to kick in like we've just discussed. But if we can hold ourselves and we can listen to the complaints and look for the unmet needs, the requests that they're not asking us for, then we're more likely to move through that argument and create resolution. But a lot of the times what we do is get into a fight about the thing. So an example would be, well, you can't expect me to put out the bins all the time. And maybe I'd put out the bins if you stopped nagging me all the time. And what's your obsession with the bins anyway? And then the fight becomes about the bins rather than the unmet needs that the complainer actually has. So if you can use this when you're finding your defenses kicking up, and you can remind yourself that somebody being critical or complaining is actually trying to communicate an unmet need. Third part is to regulate yourself. So based on polyvagal theory, we have a nervous system, and when we feel threatened, our nervous system does its job: fight, flight, freeze. And if we live in any one of those states for too long, it has quite a strong impact on our ability to relate, but also on our anxiety, on our ability to feel well in ourselves. So what we need to do when we're in conflict with somebody is we need to reassure ourselves it will be okay. That's the starting point. It will be okay. Our nervous system is going to kick in to protect us, which isn't going to be saying it will be okay. It's going to be saying it won't be okay. They never listen to you. They always do this. You need to get out, or you need to put them right, or don't say anything in case they find another flaw. So you have to start by reminding yourself it will be okay, because it starts to very gently regulate your system. You also need to remind yourself why you want this conversation to work out. And what I mean by that is, my partner, and they gave me permission to tell you, when we fight, she reminds herself, I love her. Just remember that you love her, because otherwise you're going to kill her. And so she repeatedly reminds me that she wants this conversation to work out where we're both content, because if she doesn't remind herself, she'll kill me because she's fed up of whatever we're arguing about. Okay, so you have to remind yourself why this conversation is important to resolve, rather than the initial reaction, which is either to fight, to get away from it, or not to engage with it, which is the freeze. You need to remind yourself that your defenses will hijack you to protect you, but in the long term cause harm. So for anyone that watches TikTok, they do these really quick clips where they tell you random things. And there's this joke about toxic traits, right? So they're joking about their most toxic trait. And I saw one the other day where this person said, my most toxic trait is I want to end the whole relationship when they make one mistake, because I feel so hurt. I think the whole relationship is pointless. And that's a prime example of one of the defenses that can kick in. There's other defenses, which is why bother? And then there's other defenses, which is I don't know what's wrong with them. I don't know. And it's this avoidance altogether. So what we have to do is we have to know what our defense reaction will be. We then have to see the complaints or the complaining as communicating unmet needs. And then we need to regulate ourselves so that we can stay in the relationship for this moment to have this conversation. And this happens at work too. You might have a manager who drives you nuts, who seems really critical. You get really defensive. You start being defensive to them because you're not thinking about what they're really asking you behind their complaints. So now you're defending yourself and they're defending themselves. And then you're getting more worked up. And very slowly, you're dissolving positive parts of that relationship. And research has shown we need 5 positives to 1 negative in order to stay positive about a relationship. So we need 5 positive interactions to 1 negative interaction to feel good about the relationship. And so these 3 steps will help you stay present long enough to actually resolve the relationship, rather than to pause it for it to re-emerge at another time. The second one is cognitive bias. So if you're dating someone and you want the relationship to work, you're going to create a narrative around their behavior that reassures you that the relationship will work. And you're going to look for proof that confirms that you're right. So one of the things we all do naturally is have cognitive bias. And if we can't catch that, we're going to start trapping other people in our stories about them. So for example, if you've decided that somebody isn't going to care for you very much in a relationship, then your cognitive bias is going to look for evidence that that's true. And it's going to ignore evidence that it's not true, which means that when you have a narrative about you, your partner, your family, your co-workers, what tends to happen is we look for proof that it's true. And then it does become true to us. We experience it that way because that's what we're actually focused on. So how do you work with that? So what can you do about it? So the first thing is acknowledge your narrative. So we all have narratives. We all have a narrative about who we are. We all have a narrative about the people in our lives, about our families, about our colleagues, about our co-workers. We can examine those and look at what a strong narrative we are holding and how that might be impacting the way we relate to people. The second thing we can do is be curious about the other person's perspective. So when you're trying to untangle a narrative you have about a person, what tends to be really helpful is to actually think about how they might be seeing the situation and what they may be doing in order to be okay or safe or protected, just like you. And then the third thing that we need to do is we need to discern our conclusions. So we need to be willing to not only be wrong, but to look for evidence that we're wrong. And we need to be willing to say that while I think this and they think that, I may not be 100% right here. They may not be 100% right. There may be a space that we share, just like the Venn diagram at the beginning, that the two people can influence the relationship. So one of the things that people can get really caught on this one is if you're a right fighter. So if you're someone who likes to fight and likes to be right at the end of the fight, that means that you won't really be examining your narrative. You won't really be curious about the other person's perspective, only to knock it down. And you won't really look at how you and the other person can co-create a narrative about your relationship, because you'll be busy trying to dominate that narrative because of your bias. So using these 3 very simple steps: acknowledge the narrative, consider the other person's perspective, and use both of them to discern a conclusion, you're going to find that relationships probably aren't as challenging when you're acting in that way, because you're no longer expecting somebody to understand everything from your perspective. You're actually meeting them in the Venn diagram where the relationship actually is co-created. And now you're allowing them to influence and co-create the relationship with you, rather than you dominating it with the narrative that you either fear or that you wish was true. And the last but not least is bids. So I'm going to give you a little piece around what bids are. So bids are any moment where one human reaches out to another. When someone asks you for a coffee, when someone shows you something on their phone, when somebody texts you, when somebody asks if you need something from across the room, when somebody walks with you somewhere, says, can I walk with you there? Bids are these really subtle moments. We tend to know big bids, like if you're being chatted up at a bar, that's quite a risky bid, right? And we tend to know that they're bids. But in relationships that are quite established, and this can be professional relationships, romantic relationships, family relationships, we can sometimes not see a bid for a bid. And this comes from the research that Dr. Gottman did. So Dr. Gottman put a load of people, loads of couples into rooms, and they were measured for how many times they gave each other bids. And bids were simple things like asking if they wanted a glass of water, asking how they felt, sharing something with each other, showing someone something in a newspaper. And what the research has shown is that when people in relationships give bids and they're not received well, we start to reduce how many bids we give. So in relationships where I've been given a lot of bids and they haven't been responded to, we tend to reduce the amount of bids that we give because it starts to be kind of hurtful. So in relationships that are well established, we can sometimes neglect bids. I'm going to give you an example. It's like if a friend of mine says, Sheila, do you want to come and watch the soccer? And I say, no, I hate soccer, because I do hate soccer. So I've turned down a bid and I've turned down soccer. Now, what's okay is that I've turned down soccer because that's the content that I didn't want. But what that person was also doing was a bid. And if that person gives me enough bids and I keep refusing them because it's not on the content that I want, then that person is going to receive messages that I'm not really receiving their bids. And that's not going to feel very good in the relationship. And we do see this happen in relationships that are struggling. And an example would be at work. If you're asking your manager, do they want to grab a tea or coffee, or you're popping them an email and they don't reply, these are examples of bids being dropped, and that can really harm trust in a relationship. And so when we're trying to create great relationships, we need to think about the contact that we have with somebody and when they're bidding into that shared space in the Venn diagram. What are the bids that they make, even if you might be missing them? Because if you could understand those bids, you'd be able to respond in kind. So I can say to my buddy, I really don't like soccer. I won't go on that. Do you want to go for a walk on Friday instead? So you can shift a bid, but you can still mirror it back so that you're showing that you still have care towards a person and that they're important. One of the things that can be really hard to watch is when children bid to their parents. So when a child is saying, Mom, look what I did, or Dad, look what I did, and they're on their phones, they're like, oh, yeah, that's great. And they're still on their phones. That's a lost bid for connection. And children are bidding all the time, but what children learn to do is to stop bidding when they're not responded to, because it actually hurts. And so it's really important to think about bids beyond the topic. You might say they're just showing me a picture, it doesn't matter. Or they're showing me something for the 100th time, it doesn't matter. But it's not the topic that's actually important in a bid, it's the bid. It's the fact that somebody was reaching out to create connection. And that's what we need to think about if we create great relationships. It's not about saying, oh, I'm not interested in that, so that's it. It's about understanding that you're being invited into connection when people make bids. There are ways of saying, I want to share a moment with you. And they can be as minor as showing somebody something on the telly and as major as asking somebody to marry you. Those both extremes are still bids. And sometimes they carry other meanings too. And this is where it gets a little bit more difficult or challenging for people. They have this additional meaning, which is, do you see me? Do you like me? Do I matter? Am I important? And sometimes behind bids, unconsciously, there's a deeper question, which are these 4 questions. Do you see me? Do you like me? Do I matter? Am I important? But underneath bids, what we're really asking for is to see this mirrored back to us, that somebody sees us, that they like us, that we matter, that we're important. And when bids are received well, even if the content is declined, you will see that relationships really strive because people fundamentally feel seen, liked / loved, They feel like they matter and they know that they're important to that person. And so bids have a really big value, and yet they're things we do all day without thinking much about them. And all of that can come from a text, a coffee, showing you something, a request, and even a complaint. So even a complaint can be a bid, because like we spoke about earlier, it can be a bid for unmet needs that maybe the person still themselves haven't brought understanding to. And so here are open relating techniques. Fight better, work with your cognitive bias, practice and notice your bids. So it's something to think about. If you're finding that you're not having ease with people, then any one of these three things might be really helpful for you to consider. And each one of them is based on a really particular psychology. So Fight Better comes from the Gottman Institute. Bids comes from a long line, but the Gottman Institute measured that really well. And the piece around the cognitive bias and a piece around the fighting better comes from polyvagal theory as well. So what gets in the way of relating? Fear. The minute fear kicks in, our defenses kicks in. Underdeveloped relating skills can kick in. So if you weren't exposed to as many different types of relating growing up or in your teen years, you may have underdeveloped relating skills. You may have a lack of boundaries, so it might make it really hard to share space because you might actually put people off. Low self-esteem. So sometimes we don't trust or believe that people are actually giving us bids or are actually interested in getting to know us. Trauma. So trauma shows up in lots of ways in relationships and brings a lot of challenges to relationships. I'd also say that if there's trauma in your history, trauma can also bring fruits to really great relationships, because the work that you do to support yourself through trauma can actually be really beneficial to relationships. Fear of intimacy. So this fear of really being seen as yourself or being viewed in your flaws can really reduce your ability to create great relationships. And both anxiety and depressing, they can both impact your ability to relate, because the anxiety has you distracted by fears and concerns, and the depressing can have you distracted by hopelessness. And so all of those things can make relating a little bit more challenging than not. However, in my experience, anybody who starts to work on their relationships with any one of these barriers present, once they start working on the relationship and their ability to relate, then they're actually able to move forward really well. I don't think that people with these experiences are less likely to have great relationships, but I think that they do need to work on having great relationships, as does everybody else.
First off, books. Is there anything in particular you would recommend in these areas?
Yeah, so any of the books by both of the Gottman, it's a husband and wife duo, both doctors, Gottman Institute, any of their stuff is really, really interesting around relationships. Then something much closer to home is Tony Humphrey's work, Myself, My Partner, absolutely fantastic. But that particular book really speaks to some of the kind of entanglements we can get into in relationships.
Could you give an example of a healthy relationship boundary?
A healthy relationship boundary is one in which you can respect the relationship and you respect your own needs. The piece of the relationship where we share the space is where we start to actually say, okay, what are your needs from this? What are my needs from this? So there isn't a set rule. It's more a way of going about relationships. So making sure that you aren't sacrificing yourself or you aren't neglecting your own needs in order to show up in the relationship. So ideally, when you show up in a relationship, you're showing up as a full person with your own needs met as best possible, in the best possible way that you can. And then you're sharing the opportunity for your partner or your colleague or your friend to meet your needs in an appropriate way.
Just, I suppose, in relation to the concept of bids, and is that how they might differ according to personality traits, or more a reaction to them might differ according to our personality traits.
But if we see every time a human being tries to make contact with us in some way as a bid, and we presume positive intent, we're going to find it much easier to respond to bids well. And what I will say is the best way that I've learned about it, so I learned about it in theory, but how I learned about it in practice was with children, nieces, nephews, friends, kids. Children don't have as many knockbacks on the bids. They're a lot more direct and a little bit more demanding at times. And they're bids. And even the child that pulls back and like sulks in the corner, that's a bid. It's come see me, I'm here. So if you can notice contact with people, it's going to be much easier just to see bids without having to, work through all the different kind of ways of connection or trying to know everything about attachment. If every time someone makes contact with you, you see it as a bid, you're actually already kind of a step ahead. And if you watch children, you'll see how they do bids. It's much clearer with them. They're not as discreet as I find adults have learned to be.
How would you describe a great relationship? Or how could you describe what is a healthy relationship? What's it meant to look like and feel like?
Generally, what's healthy in a relationship is the right combination for what you need as a person to thrive. And that's going to be different for everyone. Healthy is dependent on your needs, your attachment needs, your emotional needs, your physical needs, your psychological needs. And that's why knowing what you want and what you need is the starting point to a great relationship or a healthy relationship. The great relationship part, I think, is a step further than healthy. It's where we know ourselves well enough, and we know, and our partners know themselves well enough, or the people we're relating to know themselves well enough, that we can actually know what we need from the relationship, and that's able to be met in that relationship. So a great relationship really starts with you meeting your own needs as best possible, and then you having the ability to relate effectively, to understand what other people need and what other people are offering you as well.
For the name of the other author and book, I think it was the Gottman.
Yeah, the Gottman Institute. So if you look up the Gottman Institute, because there's, I can't remember their first names, it's a husband and wife, they're both doctors, but they have an institute, and they've written multiple times together and separately. And any of their books, I think, would be very beneficial.